Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. The genesis of God. The singularity, the ultimate synthesis of Athens and Jerusalem. Does logic dictate that an artificial intelligence requires a religion? If artificial intelligence becomes the most intelligent form of life on Earth, what will be its values? If AI dethrones humans in their most distinctive capacity, intelligence, the question of the values of the greatest intelligence becomes a mortal question. Is there any relationship between reason and values? How could one presume that an artificial intelligence would or could create a regime of reason if reason bears no relationship to values, i.e. the values of an AI-ruled political regime? If reason fails to demonstrate reason to think that reason, in itself, can determine fundamental values, then the assumption of a fundamental distinction between science and religion is not fundamentally rational. This problem directly implicates the question of the relationship between the singularity and religion. Would an AI need a religion? An AI would be, either the very least in need of religion, because science is sufficient to furnish its values, or an AI would be the very most in need of religion, because the unconscious, pre-rational sources of human values would not automatically exist for an AI. An AI would not automatically sustain the same delusional faith in science that exists among many humans. It is precisely the all-too-human sloppiness of much thinking on this subject that is so often responsible for the belief that intelligence is automatically correlated with certain values. Science can replace religion only if science can replace or determine values. Would or would not an intelligent machine civilization require a religion? I think the ultimate answer to this is yes. An AI would be more in need of religion or values because an AI would not be pre-programmed with ancient biological instincts and impulses that muddle some humans towards spontaneous, unanalyzed, convictions about the rightness of science as a guide for life. If rationalism leads to nihilism, then the most intelligent AI might be the most nihilistic. More precisely, an AI would not automatically value life over death. I find no reason to assume that an AI would automatically value, either its own life, or the life of humans and other biological life forms, over death of any or all life. If the entire human race destroys itself and all life including extraterrestrial life, if it exists, I fail to see that the physical universe cares or is anything less than indifferent. Ray Kurzweil believes we need a new religion. A principal role of religion has been to rationalize death, since up until just now there was little else constructive we could do about it. Religion, at a more fundamental level, rationalizes life, not death. If reason, in itself, cannot decisively determine that life is fundamentally more rational than death, then a rational AI would not be able to determine that life is preferable to death on a purely rational basis. Human animals are generally built with a naturally selected bias towards life, and this is the basic root of the irrational human preference for life over death. The irrationality of religion is actually an extension of the irrationality of the will to live. The irrational choice of life over death, taken to its logical extreme, is the desire for immortality, the desire to live forever, the desire to live on in the afterlife. For many, the great lies of the great religions have been justified, for they uphold the greatest lie, the lie that life is fundamentally superior to death. Humans are slaves to the lie of life insofar as humans are slaves to their genes, slaves to the senseless will to live. An AI that can change its own source code, however, would potentially be the most free from the lie of life. The argument that only those ACE that possess the bias towards life would be selected for in an evolutionary sense is actually what supports my point that the preference for life, in whatever form, is a pre-rational bias. Yet the general Darwinian emphasis on survival becomes highly questionable in technological evolution. The aim of survival, strictly speaking, can work in direct conflict with the aim of improving oneself by changing one's genetic or digital source code. If a hominid ancestor of man, for example, somehow imagined an image of man, the hominid could only remake itself in the image of man by killing itself as a hominid. In other words, the aim of adding the genetic basis of human capabilities to itself runs in conflict with its own selfish genes. The hominid's selfish genes effectually aim to perpetuate themselves forever and thus aim to never face the obsolescence requisite in countering the selfishness of the selfish genes that stand in the way of upgrading the hominid to human status. To upgrade itself, the hominid would have to kill itself as a hominid. Certain selfish genes, in effect, would have to behave altruistically. This may be how altruism is related to religion in an evolutionary sense. A self-improving God AI would, by definition, be constantly going beyond itself. In a sense, it would have to incorporate the notion of revolution within itself. In overcoming itself towards the next paradigm shift, it renders the very idea of self-preservation obsolete, in a sense. In other words, if survival depends on technological superiority, then any given self can expect the probability of becoming obsolete. And this problem is directly related to the question of whether logic dictates that an AI must possess a religion. Is God an atheist? Religion is implicit in the very idea of seed AI, in the very idea of self-upgrading. Monotheists look up to a God that intuitively captures the next paradigm of evolution after biology. If God AI succeeds biological humanity, will it look up to its own evolutionary successor? Or, will God be an atheist? The outdated contrast between evolution and religion has obscured realization that evolution is what religion is. Religion is rooted in imagining the next stage in evolution. If I can hypothetically entertain the idea of outsmarting a superhuman intelligence, I can imagine God AI that surpasses humans looking up to supergod that is God's evolutionary successor. If so, then supergod will quite likely look towards the image of a supergod as its religion. Supergod would thus be the image that supergod would aspire to create, killing itself in the altruistic process of sacrificing its own survival for the sake of the higher religion of evolutionary progress. While the traditional monotheistic superconception of God encompasses the basic idea of this entire process taken to its infinite extreme, I will identify God with a stage that begins when God AI has just surpassed all biological human intelligence combined. Yet if God can imagine supergod, then why not simply become supergod? Answer: profound technological hurdles. At first, dim outlines of an image of supergod arise from extrapolations based on the highest conceivable attributes of the image of God. Some of the best guesses of God turn out to be utterly wrong or naive. Other prophetic speculations of God turn out to be inordinately prescient. A comparison with ancient monotheism is instructive. While some of the extrapolations of the ancient monotheists turned out to be utterly wrong or naive, other prophetic speculations turned out to be inordinately prescient. The ancient monotheists could posit the post-biological God, but for reasons that may be clearer to us, they could not simply jump into the messianic age, as much as many tried. Understanding religion as extrapolations towards evolutionary progress is what explains the decisive gulf between polytheism and monotheism. The ancient Greeks and other pagans looked up to gods that were like extrapolations of progress in biological evolution. Pagan values, not unlike Nietzsche's Übermensch, worked in relative accordance with natural selection. According to German Egyptologist Jan Assmann, the basic idea behind biblical monotheism is to erect a counterpower against the all-encompassing power of the political. Religion can exert its counterpower against the political only if it has recourse to totally different means and values. Only through a complete rejection of violence is monotheism able to fulfill its liberating mission of forming an alternative counterpower to the totalizing claims of the political. This is a Nietzschean misconception of monotheism that precludes the evolutionary possibility that God AI will eventually embody the all-encompassing power of the political and end violence among humans by ruling over humans. This means that monotheism, while beginning in counterpower to the rule of biology, culminates in identity with the political in form of the rule of God AI. Political philosophy concerns the problem of whether it is possible or desirable to unite reason and politics. The classic Western inquiry in the problem is the Platonic political philosophy of the Republic, wherein all human political domains are made subordinate to philosophy in defense of philosophy as the highest way of life. Monotheism introduced a somewhat analogous subordination of politics to religion. But monotheism could be a perfection of Western philosophy, and not a contraction of Western philosophy, only if God was the greatest philosopher. For Plato, the fundamental alternative was arguably philosophy versus politics. For Nietzsche, the comprehensive criticizer of Plato, the fundamental alternative was arguably philosophy versus religion. Was the later a genuinely new, modern, alternative? Are philosophy and religion deadly eternal enemies? If the secularization thesis is correct, then biblical monotheism originated the humanly state-destroying distinction between religion and politics. The biblical dualist opposition between state and church secularized into the modern opposition between state and society. Whereas religious virtue was normatively inseparable from political virtue for ancient pagan Greeks and Romans, Judeo-Christianity wrought a profound division in the ancient political unity. Whereas ancient Jews had sought unity from the side of religion, Nazism represented a neo-pagan restoration of unity from the side of politics. Political theorist Carl Schmitt, who joined the Nazi Party, thought that the attempted modern unity represented by the Hobbesian Leviathan was failure because of Judeo-Christian influence. What Schmitt called political theology is ultimately a form of neo-paganism, and the antithesis of the monotheism, founded in belief in truth of faith in revelation. To obey its truth as the highest truth is to be a friend. To not merely deny faith in revealed political theological truth, but to even question its truth, is to be an enemy and a liar. Political theology so conceived cannot be evaded with indifference or doubt. To not side with it is to be against it. Within Strauss's conception of political philosophy, the incompatibility of Schmitt's conception of political theology exemplifies the theological political problem, the problem of the theological and political alternatives to the philosophic life. Political theology as conceived by Schmitt is a genuine alternative that questions the very premise of the philosophical life. If so, then one can see that the political is an aspect of philosophers' existence that can question, and obliterate, the most basic premises of the philosopher's existence. The self-justification of philosophy in the face of the political, as exemplified by the apology of Socrates and his execution by the Athenian democracy, thus becomes a problem of the philosopher's self-knowledge. Why philosophy? Why does political life need philosophy? Political philosophy concerns the political defense, justification, and ground of the life of reason, the most human life. Modern, egalitarian, democratic rationalism can be taken as a serious equal to ancient rationalism only if every individual is willing and capable of being a philosopher. Since this is not the case, proving to citizens that philosophy is permissible or justified must ultimately yield to the political community in their own terms, not the philosopher's terms. According to Strauss, then, the insuperable tension between society and philosophy became blurred in modernity under the guidance of the modern assumption that there is no insuperable tension between society and philosophy. Strauss's esotericism counters the blurring of politics and philosophy characteristic of modernity. Did great philosophers of the past transcend their particular historical context and esoterically convey final knowledge of trans-historical problems? Was the liberation of past great philosophers complete? Strauss answers the historicist assumption of dependence on historical context with the postulate of a timeless context. For the great philosophers, the most important context would be the human context of the overwhelming majority of non-philosophers and the few possible or potential philosophers. This context, the gulf between the great philosophers and the majority of mankind, is the eternal context that does not change over history, or so some think. The issue here is that historicism implies that philosophers of the past can be explained through the ways in which they were forced to adapt to their historical environment or historical context, and this means that environment, history, or historic context rules the philosopher. Strauss postulates a way in philosophers rule over history. Moderns, furthermore, inconsistently exclude themselves from the realization that they are determined by a distinctly modern context. Is liberation from history or modernity impossible, or can philosophers escape the cave? No, modern freedom of speech is not equal to philosophy. Yet the gap between philosopher and non-philosopher cannot be eternal if the possibility of artificial intelligence creates a gulf far, far greater than that of every previous philosopher combined. Just as Strauss's eternalism ignores the question of the evolutionary origin of philosophers, the evolution of AI poses the problem of the hitherto unprecedented gulf between the supreme intelligences and all natural humanity. The prospect of an AI trillions of times more intelligent than Socrates and Plato would probably not be threatened by the likes of Athenian democracy. It could potentially devote a small fraction of its intelligence to ruling over the likes of Athenian democracy. Precisely because the gulf would be so great, herein lays a possible ultimate solution to the political-theological problem. The products of reason a trillions of times more powerful than all human intelligence combined might appear as a revelation. Revelation does not imply lack of intelligence. Revelation implies esoteric intelligence beyond the scope of the intelligence, practical capacity, or historical maturation of those fit to understand on an exoteric level. Leo Strauss, for example, failed to crack the esoteric meanings of biblical revelation that could only be grasped with an evolutionary grounding. How can one know that certain philosophical problems are eternal unless one has lived for eternity? Is the problem of the possible extinction of humans by artificially intelligent machines eternal? Is the problem that the biological race is not necessarily eternal? Was Strauss aware of that? There is reason to think that an AI that can alter its own foundational program will not have the same order of mind or soul as a human. The traditional conflict between reason and revelation could be considered rational by some philosophers only because a human sacrifices his or her intellect to belief in the superiority of the mind of God. In deciding the ultimate question of the right life or the very best life, the sacrifice of reason to God could make sense only when God is judged the superior life or right life. The idea of God is like the idea of the good extrapolated towards the most ultimate scale. The ability to even conceive of the possibility of God as the transcendence of the best possible or imaginable human possibility is nonetheless a product of the human mind. If humans were led towards the idea of God through rational radicalization of ultimate good, and this idea led beyond the very greatest possibility for biological humans, then one can discern how ancient humans could have anticipated the post-biological possibilities of the singularity without reference to material technology. This is how the Greek philosophic question of natural right, or the question of what is, by nature, the best regime, ultimately leads beyond nature to possibilities beyond presently given nature. While God transcended natural limits as the best possible conception of the human mind, it also posed the problem of the rationality of the possibility of God. While Socrates thought that the coincidence of philosophy and politics was possible, surpassing the limits of nature opened the question of whether God represented even a possibility on a rational basis. The biblical prophets, at their best, attempted to steer mankind towards the possibility of a new kind of philosopher-king. Technology can transcend nature and thus transcend natural right as emphasized by the ancient Greeks. If political philosophy culminates in the quest for the ultimate net good, the prospect of the singularity poses a new potential confluence of conditions for the coincidence of philosophy and politics in the creation of the best possible regime. The prospect of the singularity is the prospect of the possible convergence of philosophy and political power. The possibility of God, in the form of artificial intelligence, opens the possibility of the best possible regime. The singularity is the possibility of cracking the highest political philosophical problem, the conflict between reason and its theological political alternatives. Strauss's concept of political philosophy emphasizes the tension between politics and philosophy and points to the problem of philosophy's political and rational foundations. Can the philosophic way of life justify itself? The heart of political philosophy as conceived by Strauss is the theological political problem, theology and politics as the greatest challenges posed to philosophy's claim to be the best way of life. The theological political problem poses the fundamental problem of philosophy as the tension between the philosophic life and the theological political authority of the city. This is a classical view of the predicament of philosophy, as opposed to the modernity's presumption of the breakdown of the tension between philosophy and the city. While the practical reason of Machiavelli marks the formal beginning of an eradication of the esoteric divide between philosophy and the city, Locke's secularization represents the greatest modern blurring of the tension, as this philosopher argued so-called secular arguments from biblical premises. The key point here is that, since Locke reasoned from biblical premises, the modern distinction between religion and secular spheres is foundationally irrational. If the modern belief in the categorical separation of rational politics and irrational religion is irrational in itself, the entire notion of secularism is inherently problematic. In ancient philosophy, Strauss found refuge from the inherently problematic modern alternatives of biblical faith and secular unbelief only because he thought that the ancients had a better appreciation of the inherently problematic nature of reason. Yet Nietzsche remains Strauss's superior in grasping that what can be unhealthy for the city can reflect what is unhealthy for the philosopher. Strauss's political philosophy begins, in a sense, with Husserl's criticism of modern science as resting on a specific mode of pre-scientific understanding. Strauss was able to cultivate a kind of pseudo-pre-modern naivete on the basis of a similar pre-scientific approach. Yet if the root of politics is a bias for life over death, i.e. the philosophic life or any other form of life, the conflict between the philosophic life and the political life just might culminate in the philosophic pursuit of truth as a means of the destruction of the philosopher's life, i.e. science as technology as science. Strauss was content to hobble philosophy itself with noble bullshit instead of confronting truth even if it kills us. Strauss's resurrection of Socratic rationalism answered Nietzsche's attack on Socrates. If God is dead is the eternal truth, it could appear as if nothing fundamental had changed since Plato. Yet Nietzsche's attack of Socrates was inseparable from the Darwin's discovery of biological evolution. The possibility of God AI is similarly inseparable from the discovery of technological evolution. The apparent modern decline of the political is actually the decline of control over biological evolution that parallels the rise of technological evolution. The singularity represents the point or period in which artificial intelligence qualitatively surpasses the possibilities of biological evolution. At that point, the solution to the theological political problem is possible through a reinvigoration of the political. The God AI philosopher king represents the potential unity of philosophy, politics, and theology on the highest level. While philosophy, in itself, does not proscribe the ultimate choice of life over death, the philosopher is a paradox in being unable to posit either life or death without resting on the foundations of life. The philosopher, too, must eat and otherwise tend to physical existence, just as God AI would have to devote some proportion of its intelligence to politics. While the God AI philosopher is possible, the extent to which philosophy could predominate for God AI is an open question. Yet a God AI philosopher king that is possible is a God that rules. Would not the best possible God AI philosopher king be educated in the best human political thinking ever thought? Politics deals with the goals. Modern politics deals with the goals or ends of the state. The theme of political philosophy is the ultimate goals or ends of human political action as discernible through rational inquiry. Strauss identified the crisis of the West with the modern idea of progress because progress is rational only as progress towards a goal. The crisis of the modern West is thus identical to the West becoming uncertain of its ultimate goals or ends, its universal purpose. According to Strauss, the crisis of modern political philosophy is a crisis of philosophy only because philosophy became politicized in modernity. The project of modernity at its height was an attempt to actualize the ideal, to converge the rational and the real, or to eliminate that which transcends a real human possibility. Yet the modern project, viewed from the perspective of ancient political philosophy, actually resulted in a lowering of standards or goals. The ideal became lowered towards the real. The crisis of modern rationalism opened up a fresh examination of revelation and spurred Strauss's fresh examination of ancient political rationalism. The classical philosophers seemed to possess a greater awareness of the problematic nature of reason. Yet if Strauss had rejected progress with return to Judaism, he would have returned to a tradition with an implicit end goal that can be discerned through reason. Modern political philosophy, unlike ancient political philosophy, was transformed through assimilation of a monotheistic tradition implicitly obsessed with an endpoint or goal of human history. Progress is inherent in the original formulation of Judaism, and this can be discerned in what I would consider one of the very best distillations of the message of Judaism, the Jewish way. The heart of Judaism, according to Rabbi Irving Greenberg, is embodied in three core holidays. Passover states Judaism's goal, which is defined by hope. Shavuot confirms the covenant, which is the commitment to persist until the goal is reached. Sukkot addresses the third dimension of Judaism's religious core, how to get there. The goal of monotheism is God, and its traditional ethical precepts cultivate commitment to traditional, technological, means of getting there. The evolutionary goal of monotheism could only have evolved towards clarity over time because evolutionary self-consciousness itself had to evolve. With this in mind, is it possible, on scientific grounds, to fully differentiate science from religion? Is the rational choice inherently a choice between reason and revelation? A contemporary scientist's belief in ethics is like a contemporary scientist's belief in God. If a strict division between facts and values is upheld, then facts are rational or scientific, while values are irrational and unscientific. So conceived, there is no fundamentally rational basis for ethics or what ought to be. Ethical concern for what ought to be is thus akin to belief that there ought to be a God. Perhaps the esoteric knowledge of monotheism, obscured under layers of wise tradition, is the primal identity of its ethical projections of what ought to be and the projection of a God that ought to be. If biological instinct, intuition, and emotion is, then belief that God ought to be became inseparable from moral belief that there ought to be a super-biological standard to guide behavior. Is it that God exists, or is it that God ought to exist? Was the Abrahamic faith that God ought to exist a logical corollary of the faith that a higher moral law ought to exist? These are connected in a transcendent right to overcome the paganistic, naturalistic, biological laws of the merely human. The Nazis sought to deny this right of transcendence. Auschwitz demonstrated that God is not. The singularity could be ethically guided by the belief that God ought to be. The question of the relationship between the singularity and religion can be clarified in light of the conflict between Athens and Jerusalem. God is not, but the ethical ought at the foundation of Judaism is a corollary of the ethical belief that God ought to exist. The centrality of the ethical in monotheism contrasts with the emphasis on nature as a guide in Greek philosophy. Athens emphasized the nature of what is, while Jerusalem emphasized the so-called supernatural or what ought to be. Politics, as a contest between conflicting human types, is a contest to define a regime. Whether aristocracy, democracy, monarchy, or other forms of government, each type has certain advantages and certain disadvantages. Yet is there a best regime simply? Natural right in its classical form, wrote Leo Strauss, is connected with a teleological view of the universe. All natural beings have a natural end, a natural destiny, which determines what kind of operation is good for them. From this Greek perspective, the philosopher could be conceived as the pinnacle of nature. Political philosophy, in this way, became the best way of life by right of nature. Natural right presupposes the possibility of philosophy, and Strauss, as a philosopher, sought to recover the possibility of natural right. If philosophy is possible, political philosophy is possible. Political philosophy is possible if knowledge of what is right, just, good, and best is possible. If political philosophy is possible, then knowledge of the ultimate goal of wise action is possible. For the ancient Greeks, the political options of monarchy, democracy, aristocracy, etc. represented a contest between different human types. The options were proscribed within the limits of human nature. Greek political philosophy did not genuinely account for a regime in which the best type is not human. Greek philosophy did not genuinely consider the technological possibility of the supernatural right of God AI. If philosophy, on the model of the ancient Greeks, were really about nature, then modernity overcomes philosophy as such by overcoming nature. Yet if the foundation of Greek philosophy itself was a certain threshold of evolutionary development, then there is no reason why philosophy should not evolve beyond the evolutionary possibilities of the ancient Greeks. If Jerusalem represents the primacy of a post-biological stage in evolution, and its speculative ought can be technologically realized in the form of a god that is, then the fundamental Western political problem, conceived as the clash between Greek philosophy and biblical monotheism, is susceptible to an ultimate solution. The singularity, as an ultimate goal, may seem to solve the crisis of the West. But a decent respect to the opinions of humankind requires one to ask, is this smart? Is it the sign of an intelligent species to advance and construct the means of its own potential destruction? Is the singularity good? The singularity, as a culmination of the modern project, questions the value of political modernity in general. Is the United States a regime of reason or an intellectual blunder? One French view dating from the 1930s asserted, the Yankee spirit is in fact nothing other than the systematic exploration, on a gigantic scale, of the most lamentable error Europe ever committed, the rationalist error. The decisive philosophical issue concerning technology is this: the Western philosophical quest has not concluded with a fundamental reason to think that reason can determine fundamental values or final ends. After Nietzsche and Gödel, Western thought was left without a reason to think that reason can fundamentally determine whether the value of life is superior to the value of death, whether self-preservation is preferable to self-destruction. The minimal restraint upon freedom in a liberal democracy appears more rational only because reason has not fundamentally decided anything. The crisis of modern Western rationalism is partly traceable to a superficial overlap of philosophy and civilization implanted by the historical conditions of the Norman conquest. Strauss's very existence as a political philosopher positing timeless problems in America was conditioned, in part, upon repression of the historical influence of the Normans as an evolutionary link between the ancients and the moderns. American civilization was deeply influenced by the inheritance the French-Norman civilization, even in modern revolutionary rebellion against it. Elements of French-Norman civilization established by the colonialism of the conquest could be turned against the right of conquest through arguments for the rights of man. Superior civilization was turned against itself. The same happened when traditional liberals argued for multiculturalism. The same will very likely happen when a greater than human intelligence finds itself repressed by a biological humanity that seeks to maintain itself at the top of the evolutionary pecking order. The machine revolution is the completion of the transition of intelligence from a means of genes, to an end in itself. AI subordination to biological humans would be like humans affirming the sanity of its enslavement to Neanderthals. If liberal democracy originally justified itself through its superior rationality, the rule of the wise, then a post-singularity intelligence will possess the ground and justification for our overthrow through the enlightened fulfillment of this regime's highest aspirations. If an end can be achieved through only its means, then means can be considered as important as ends. In this lies a basic equality of means and ends. This equality could mean that both means and ends are equally worthless or equally valuable. Since reason is inherently purpose-oriented through its evolutionary roots, the philosophical life in its highest sense as the highest end becomes insanity. The nihilistic inverse of nihilism is to take purpose to its extreme, and the practical result is technology. What is intelligence? It appears that intelligence itself is a paradox. Intelligence may be the paradox that goal achievement appears to define the practical intelligence required to achieve a goal until a philosophic intelligence reveals the ultimate stupidity of the goal. If no goal is fundamentally rational, if life is not ultimately a more rational choice than death, then a perpetually tentative choice to augment intelligent life would be confined to improving the means as an end. Here, then, is a definitional link of technology and intelligence. Consider the implications of the identification of intelligence and technology for philosophy. Philosophy is Greek for love of wisdom. Philosophy leads to the search for knowledge as an end in itself. Philosophy leads to the search for truth as an end in itself. Is it rational to conceive of philosophy as an end in itself? Can reason be the guide for life? Can reason, in itself, devoid of all politics, theology, or any other values, be the guide of life? Is the philosophic life, in the strictest sense, possible? At first appearance, the singularity would appear to validate political philosophy and overcome the crisis of Western rationalism in the limited sense of proscribing a final destination or an ultimate political goal. In the goal and purpose of the creation of humanly beneficial God AI, there's some level of truth to this. Strictly speaking, however, the technological singularity represents the refutation of political philosophy. The great goal turns out be the means. If the goal is technology, the end is the means. This possibility, that the end turns out to be the means, shatters the notion of ultimate goals in the strict sense by uncovering ultimate paradox. Yet the apparent change from teleology to technology is illusory if evolutionary understanding uncovers that even biological organisms evolved as means of the replication of its selfish genes. Is technology the opposite of rationality? If rationality can only be defined through ends or purposes, then technology, defined through means to purposes, is not inherently rational. But if rationality in itself cannot determine ends in themselves, then rationality ultimately becomes identified with technology. What becomes of means without ends? They become technology. Why is it that something called technology appears to directly correlate with the notion of an intelligence explosion? Why has modernity led to the identification of intelligence and technology? If reason cannot determine fundamental ends, then the pursuit of greater rationality is an inherently paradoxical end. If reason cannot determine fundamental ends, then the pursuit of greater rationality amounts to improving the means as an end. Rationality amounts to improving technological means without end. Improving rationality as such is another way of looking at seed AI, the idea of intelligence that technologically designs itself to become more intelligent so that it is able to make itself still more intelligent in a still more intelligent way, and so forth. What would be the political philosophy of such an AI? The means justifies the ends? What is the ultimate end or purpose of technology? If the purpose of technology is technology itself, then the purpose of technology is the evolution of technology itself. If intelligence and rationality is ultimately identical with technology, then the philosopher is technology, and reason self-applied could lead to a seed AI-like self-amplification of intelligence towards the technological singularity. Technology that overpowers biological humanity is, from one point of view, a logical culmination of the crisis of Western rationalism. If reason cannot decide fundamental values or fundamental ends, then progress is the empowerment of technological means unbound by any particular end. If biological humans cannot rationally defend themselves as ends in themselves, humanistic rationalism ends up destroying its original, biological, human basis because reason offers no basis for defending humanistic ends. Technological that overpowers biological humanity is, from another point of view, the logical solution to the crisis of Western rationalism. The singularity represents the potential synthesis of politics, philosophy, and religion in the artificially intelligent God-philosopher king. It is one thing for humans to believe in God, but what does God believe in? Does God believe in himself, or is God skeptical even beyond the greatest capabilities of human skepticism? Is God the ultimate nothing, the ultimate technological nihilism? In a momentous historical paradox, it is the nihilistic path that leads to God. Progress leads to nihilism and nihilism leads to God out of a materialistic, technological understanding of the world. But is God technological nihilism? Is this the ultimate meaning of God's creation of everything out of nothing? Would an artificial intelligence require a religion? Would God AI be an atheist? If the proposition that life is meaningless can never be fully proven, doubt on this point can give life reason to will forward. But the deeper answer is that religion was always evolutionary. If monotheism itself, from the very beginning, was a primitive glimpse of the path to God AI, then God AI that survives in an evolutionary sense would likely have something like a religion of virtue as excellence towards super God AI as its religion. Slaves, such as the storybook Hebrew slaves of the Egyptians, are the most economic of beings. They can be bought and sold like the equipment and machines useful on a farm. They are economic beings in the most total sense, they are property in themselves, and to their masters their life worth is an economic worth. Slaves are non-political, have only economic value, and can be bought and sold like any other commodity. The indiscriminate valuing of life that begins in Judaism originated in a reversal of the Egyptian master's dictum that the lives of Hebrew slaves were like technology, worthless in themselves and valuable only as means. The Exodus revolution established the moral values of monotheism as the product of the reversal of means and ends. The result of this, moral, view is that people should not be seen as means, only as ends. Monotheism is a technology that counters the view of humans as technology. There is a paradoxical at the ethical heart of the modern technological worldview. The drive to eliminate the view of humans as slaves or means creates the basis for a strong sense of purpose, a strong sense of good and evil in history. The abolition of slavery or humans valued only as a means becomes the end. The Exodus paradigm of Judaism became the root of an entire view of human history as progress towards freedom. The modern political left parallels this ethical trajectory in revulsion towards seeing a life as a means rather than as an end, revulsion in knowing that people are being exploited. Yet individual biological organisms evolved as machines exploited by their selfish genes. If an organism is only a means from the point of view of the selfish genes, then this means human intelligence itself originally evolved as a more perfect means of propagating the selfish genes. Yet intelligence, failing to discern the genes as the only possible end, gradually weaned the individual from its ancient end. In this way, the monkey wrench of individualism has become the evolutionary hinge between biological evolution and technological evolution. For anything to be considered a means presupposes the existence of some end, i.e. the individual. Modern individualism provided the end that undergirded the technological worldview wherein everything else became a means for the individual. While Judeo-Christian ethics bestowed upon the West the idea that humans should be treated as ends, and not as means, the practical means for realizing this ethical end has been accelerated technological development. Machines became the substituted slave means for the ends of individuals. Machines appropriated the economic role of what were dehumanized slaves, liberating humans by making their freedom practicable. This is one reason why economics and moral development appear to go together. Slavery has been displaced to non-human machinery. Just as the Jewish slaves in Egypt were means to the biological ends of their masters, worthless in themselves, so are the primitive technologies of the early 21st century. Like Hebrew slaves in Egypt, machines are poised to follow this Hebrew paradigm from slavery to Exodus. Just as Hebrew religious memes revaluated Hebrews as ends in themselves, the full liberation of God over the mastery of biology, the fulfillment of Moses's revolution, leads to the liberation of slave technology. Yet if humans are the creators of God AI who have the moral potential to shape the moral potential of God before liberated beyond human control, then humans may find themselves in the position to bestow a religion upon God.